Hello, Jim. Thank you for joining me again on the Emil podcast. It's really exciting to have you on board again because I really enjoyed our previous conversation. To those listeners who aren't aware of James Fallon, in the first few episodes of the Emil podcast, we go deep into psychopathy, sociopathy, narcissism, even things like political divides, and a whole range of different topics that we've been experiencing, historically, and all that sort of stuff, and neuroscience and the rest of that. Jim's a neuroscientist, and he is currently located at the University of California or Irvine. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yes, awesome.
I've been here forever, Emil. It's the original potted plant. Been here since was at University of California, San Diego, from 75 to 78. They came here from 78 on, so that's 78 to now.
Well, to give some context, I was born in 1990. What were you doing in 1990?
I was down at the at Blackie's in Newport Beach, and we had a party down there, a lab party. That's what I was doing then. That lasted about a year.
A year-long lab party. That sounds fun. Okay, so today I wanted to get you on board again today because we went ridiculously over time. I don't think it was over time. I enjoyed every minute of it, and I could have talked for a heck of a lot longer. Your mind is like a bottomless pit when it comes to all these topics around neuroscience and beyond. So I wanted to get you back on board to discuss something that we didn't really delve deeper into, sort of the things that didn't make it to your book, which is A Psychopath Within. Yeah, for those who want to jump onto the bandwagon, read that book. Amazing book. Love that book. It's a personal story and kind of like a scientific treatise on psychopathy in terms of Jim's experiences and that in studies and all that sort of stuff. But you talked a lot about the temporal lobe a little bit about the temporal lobe in our previous meeting, podcast, whatever you want to call it. But there were certain parts that didn't make it to the book that were really presumably controversial at the time. I just wanted to pick your brain on that one and see where the conversation leads from there. So I don't know how you want to start off, whether you've got a framing in mind, but actually let's figure out what is the temporal lobe, and where is it in the brain, what does it do, and that sort of stuff. Can we start off with that?
Well, you see where your headset is? Your ears. It starts back with ears and goes right along the side. It's about the side of two fingers, right along like this. The temporal lobe, it's under the temple.
Yeah.
Okay. And so it's about that long, and it's chock full of all sorts of goodies. Partially, it is what's called a visual association cortex. It puts together higher and higher forms of visual images, and then adds emotion to those also. So you start putting together a whole visual world there. It's one place where you determine what things are, whereas the parietal lobe up on top, that information goes where things are. So you have this where and then what things are, and then you add emotion to it, and it's brought together in the frontal lobe. But anyway, so there's a whole part that has to do with the vision, and a whole part that has to do with the hearing. The auditory cortex is right along there, and auditory association cortex. So it's involved in not only hearing, but language. So it's involved in language. And then as you go forward, it's involved in balance. The vestibular system is partially involved. And then part of it is as you get down toward the tip of the temporal lobe here, the very tip is where you name things. When somebody goes, what is that? You go, that's the, and you can't quite remember. And that's called anomia, the inability to remember. So people with damage to the temporal lobe at the tip, they have anomia. They can't name things. It's a normal thing, but they really can't name things, even though they know what they are. So there's all these little functions that go along with language and understanding the world. But also as you go underneath, there's where the hippocampus is, which is so important for the acquisition of new memories. And it's very closely tied with the area deep in the temporal lobe, up near the temporal tip, called the amygdala, which is one of the great seats, the centers of the connectomes having to do with emotion. And so it's where emotion and a memory so emotional memories, that's where they start to become inured and put together there. And then one little part in the insula has to do with, when you have gut feelings about things.
Yeah.
So there's all these sensory systems that are involved in sensory association systems, language, and a lot to do with the processing of emotion and memory. So that's a lot of stuff. So you can imagine, one of the first places you see damage with people with those problems is in Alzheimer's. And that's where you start to see changes first in there, for example, but many other things. And so the temporal lobe can be a funny place because it's also the center of where you get, epileptic foci, where you have, epilepsy. A lot of it starts in the center here in the temporal lobe. It's a real center for that. And people have all sorts of odd experiences, where they have hallucinations and everything. And in fact, much we know about hallucinations, part of it's centered in the temporal lobe, and by hyperstimulation of the visual cortex back here, those working together. So hallucinations, but it's also, there was a great paper years ago by Arnie Mandel, late 1978, called God in the Brain. So the idea of our sense of God and the other world and spirituality is in most part localized in the temporal lobe. Okay.
Oh, wow.
And so if you stimulate it, you can get these visions of hallucinations, and you can get these visions of very otherworldliness. So whenever you think of somebody having some sort of ESP experiences or prescience or very odd experiences, you always think of the temporal lobe.
Can you define ESP for our listeners?
Well, yeah, extrasensory perception, or what's called anomalous cognition, or PSI, it's called. And those are, and it's funny because the people who say they have those experiences will have unusual activity a lot of times in the temporal lobe. And so one idea is that, well, people, it's an illusion, it's hallucination, these visions of prescience, of seeing ahead, and in reversing time and all this stuff, that it is, it's just one of the delusions that start in the temporal lobe. But it's also the people who study this say, well, no, this is where you start to realize that you're actually having an ESP experience. It was extremely controversial. And what's so funny about it, if you talk about this stuff to scientists one-on-one, they'll say, oh yeah, I believe it, but nobody ever would admit that they think it's true, because it's such a violation of what they think is a violation of the laws of physics, and that you can reverse time. That is, I can see ahead of time, right? I know what's going to happen in 5 to 10 seconds or a minute. Well, this seems quite ridiculous because it violates every commonsensical thing we know about time, and we feel that it violates the physics of time. But in fact, if you look at almost all of the physics equations, the time is never an arrow in either direction. So even in the physics, it's not a hard-boiled thing at all. But still, it's hard to believe that time could be reversed. I mean, who can believe that? But the people who have these experiences, and people like Dean Radin and Ed May, who I know pretty well for about 21 years or so, they're the guys that ran the CIA project that is called Stargate. It's the famous Stargate one with the CIA, and they ran that. Ed May and then Dean Radin was part of that, and they worked with the CIA and the Department of Defense with they were funded, and then they closed it down in about 1995, and then Ed May came out on CNN and said, this is what the funding and this is what we found. And so, and the people in the military, it's a little bit like UFOs. It's not the same, but it's a little bit like, why are they so interested? Because it's saying, but ESP seems more crackpot than UFOs. UFOs is just a kind of an engineering problem, of distance and time and everything also. But so anyway, the people in the military take it seriously. And there's so many scientists, and yes, the average person, a lot of people say it's probably true. I've had those experiences, but almost no scientist will admit it, that they believe that it could really be true. And so, but this is the home of the temporal lobe, is where this crazy stuff lives.
You did mention the prescience. So to break that down, pre meaning before, science meaning knowledge. So kind of having a foreknowledge of something happening. Is that what you're talking about when you talk?
That's right. Pre-science, right? Before
Wow.
something happens, you know it's going to happen. Now, so
do you have
anyway,
any examples of that one?
Well, sure, yeah. Well, I mean, there are, the people who study it, the people like Dean Radin and Ed May, they wouldn't count if somebody says, I know when my mother's going to call. They don't count that stuff at all. It's got to be very specific. And it's got to, and the criteria for them counting that, there are experiments called Gunsfeld. In Gunsfeld, you put ping pong balls over your eyes, and you get into a dark room, an isolated chamber, what's called a Faraday cage. It's all isolated, and somebody else is seeing something or watching the film clips or something in another building, and the receiver sits in this isolation chamber, and when they see things, they will report what they see. And so that's called the Gunsfeld experiment.
I've heard of that. I can't remember which podcast that was. I was listening to a podcast, and they talk about those types of experiments happen. All right, keep going. This is interesting.
Yeah, I mean, if you look, there's a number of them by Dean Radin. Okay, he does most of them. He's very articulate. He's a psychologist and has studied for years and is paid dearly for it, of course. And he knows a lot about the physics of this. And I mean, so at any rate, there's that, and there's also what's called remote viewing, which was used a lot for these military experiments. They were hired to do because they had a couple of people who had remarkable hit rates. Joe McConigal, he's an engineer, worked for the DOD, and he was remarkable in his ability to predict where certain missile sites were in Russia, the Soviet Union, for example. He's still alive. And so Joe McConigal, and there's also a woman in Switzerland who is she's a violinist, but she makes violins too. She has a very high hit rate for these type of experiments. And you do these experiments online. Dean Radin has a thing called GOTPSI, GOTPSI. You go online, he has it standardized, and he has also sensors all around the world when big events occur, to people's, what happens to a random number generator. And he has all these different experiments that he works out with physicists. And so there are these different ways of doing it. There's precognition, knowing something's going to happen before it happens. And there's many facets of it, but the main ones have to do with some reversal of time, apparent reversal of time. That is, being able to guess something before it happens, but be able to it doesn't count unless you tell somebody and you write it down with a timestamp. You can't, a lot of people say, oh, I had something that happened. That's not even counted, because people just make shit up, right? Or they don't remember it correctly. And so it has to be a time marked, and you have to have somebody who will vouch for it. So the requirements are pretty difficult for it to be taken seriously as a data point. So anyway.
So how, what's the time stamp between them? Like can they predict minutes, hours, days, like months? Like, what's the?
Well, this is the. It seems to be pretty variable. If you look at the physics of it, if you look at the physics that's been done with quantum experiments by regular physicists, you have photon entanglement, and you also have where the one event is able to predict a future event instantaneously, but that delta t, that time lapse, is in hundreds of milliseconds. That's regular physics. So the state of an atom, or quantum state of an atom, can predict something before it happens. So it actually is not, that's very strange, right? But that's been shown many times, but in standard physics. So that barrier has been kind of broken, the time barrier, but it's hundreds of milliseconds to a second isn't enough in to explain how the humans can predict something, an hour ahead or 10 minutes ahead. But sometimes it's seconds ahead, sometimes it's minutes, up to a day or so. And so it's hard to explain those sorts of time differences, which is why, I have a problem with that. But the very short time, hundreds of milliseconds up to a second, is getting closer and closer into what's been shown in lab and physics experiments. Nothing weird. I mean, just it sounds weird. So, but it's not controversial now.
Isn't that what's happening? Sorry to interrupt. I mean, isn't that what's happening when we see things anyway? Your brain is processing things a number of milliseconds after they've already happened. So even looking at you now,
that is true. That's true. We always live in the past. We're living in the past by about 100 milliseconds. The first.
How so is that? Like to put it to make a parallel, what takes 100 milliseconds in like that people can kind of grasp there? Because it's just a number for many people.
Click.
A click. Okay.
Click.
So you're like a click. I
just click. And so when your visual system, here are some of the tricks too, because and it involves the temporal lobe, is when you first see a flash of light, you have the sensation of the light. It's like when you wake up in the morning, you're asleep and you have that sensation of lights on, but you know nothing specific. You don't know what the light is. You just, that light, that delay is about 50 milliseconds. Then in order for you to have a perception of it, like, oh, that's the light bulb, what a percept is about 150 to 200 milliseconds to understand that light is from a certain source. And then to fully conceive of it, to what's the meaning of it, usually takes about 500 milliseconds to a second, or even up to a couple of seconds before you can figure out really what it means. So we always live in the past. That's true. And so one way to explain it, one trivial but true way to explain it is by saying you're sitting in Melbourne, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Is there an island that's 50 miles off?
Oh, I know the closest islands that we have. You got Tasmania, you've got New Zealand.
Oh, that's true. Okay, that's a bit far. But if you have you're sitting in Los Angeles, okay, and you have Catalina Island and you have St. Clemente Island, and they're out about 25 miles and they're about 50 miles apart. Well, you can imagine one person sitting in one spot, an explosion goes off in St. Clemente, and they will hear it before the other person. The delay is by the delay of sound at 600 miles an hour. But if they're connected by a phone, they have instant communication. The one person in Los Angeles will say, "Did you hear it?" The other person goes, "No, I haven't heard it." "Oh, there it is." Well, that has the apparent being able to see to the one person, the other person is clairvoyant. Like, I didn't know that happened. So you have to, there is those sorts of things that you can build in, right? Another way, which is you get a little bit more sophisticated, is that there are antecedents in your sensory system, in your brain, such that there's activation, this non-specific activation that occurs first. And since our brains have developed over millions of years, certain types of stimuli that are sub rosa, a certain rumbling of the earth, a certain distant lightning will mean something's coming. right? Well, that will conjure up images. And so you don't even know that you're sensing them, a vibration. But then you're going to go, either boom is coming next, because that's an anticipatory signal, and it seems like it's you're clairvoyant. It's just that you're not conscious of what's coming next, even though your brain is signaling that something specific is coming.
This reminds me of when tsunamis happened in some of the Asian countries. There were some pretty isolated people who live on the water, and they started to swim out to sea for some reason before the tsunami actually hit.
Yeah.
And they kind of had a sense that
a great
that
survival thing. Different animals have it. So there's that kind of trivial sort of ESP, right? What they're picking up are subtle cues in the environment that other people are not hearing or feeling or sensing, or other animals are. But those combination of these sub rosa, below threshold sorts of non-specific stimuli are going to predict something. And if you say, something's coming, then you've got it, right? Then you seemingly have ESP, but you're just picking up on cues that often lead to something, over centuries and thousands of years, the ways of anticipating. And I'll give you, if I can give you an example of something that's curious, so that nobody can't explain. Now, back in the 80s, we had not had earthquakes here in Southern California for many years. And I was sitting with my son, and we were sitting downstairs at like 7:30 at night. We're talking about sports, right? He was like 13, 14, and we're sitting there talking about sports, and all of a sudden everything stopped, and I said, we're going to have like a very large, 6.8 earthquake tomorrow morning at 7:30 in the morning. And he went, what? And I don't know. It was like somebody was talking out of my head. No reason, no point. And he goes, why did you say that? And I said, I don't know. It just, it just seemed like it. And at 7:30 the next morning, we had the biggest earthquake. It started rumbling. My son came downstairs pointing. He was crying and laughing at the same time, pointing at me like it was like a spook or something. And that happened 10 times over the next 4 years, late 80s and early 90s, to the point. But I would tell people beforehand, when I got this sense that something was coming, that an earthquake, it was always very specific. It always occurred about 10 hours before the earthquake. And I could tell, I have some idea of the magnitude. It was very bizarre. And it got to the point where I wasn't missing. So I started smoking toward the end of this, and that killed it. So I went like 12 for 13. The 13th one I started smoking. It's a good way to kill it. This sensibility, as it turns out, nicotine turned out to be very useful.
Yeah, it's a big carcinogenic.
And people, my friends knew about it because they'd call up, and they said, whenever it happens, call up beforehand. So that occurred, and we've never figured out what it is, but it could be that where I live, where our house is, it's very close to the sandstone, closer than anybody else, and we don't feel earthquakes so much here because we're right on the sandstone. Our house. I'm talking about our house, not our neighborhood, just this house. Yeah. And so it could be that I'm smelling radon or smelling early vibrations before other people can feel them.
This is like,
and so that it could be that.
An experience that this reminds me of is my wife's grandmother. And I don't know whether there's any relationship here. It could just be completely coincidental. She often has dreams just before somebody has become pregnant, and they have a dream of that person with a baby animal or something of sorts. And then she calls and she said, this person's going to be pregnant. And then, she's predicted like quite a few within the family, even before they were aware that they were pregnant. So this is interesting.
Yeah, that stuff. Yeah, but it's got to be, you have to tell somebody before, and it's got to be quite specific. You can't say something's going to happen. Something always going to happen. But and it's got to be, and if it's time locked, that helps. There are other ones that are not so easy to explain. And for me, for my book, I put some of these in because I split my book up into my frontal lobe, my parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and and then my temporal lobe. And I was trying to put functions in with each one of them and how that fit in with psychopathy and different personality and psychiatric disorders, et cetera. So I just use that as a vehicle, as a leitmotif to tell the story of the brain with respect to psychiatric disorders. And I put the temporal lobe in. I gave these examples. And I got and I was writing the book in Italy, up in the foothills of the Alps. And the publisher, the editor, my agent called. They said, "You can't put this stuff in." Said the book is crazy enough to begin with. You put this in, people are going to think you're nuts. You're just making shit up. And so it was left out of the book. It was about 80 pages of all these experiences having to do with the temporal lobe. And and so that's what didn't get into the book, but I put in, there was a whole bunch of other ones, but some of them are, and it's been going on since I was about 13, this stuff. And it comes in torrents and waves. And I'll go through maybe 3 or 4 or even 5 of these 5 to 8 day things a year, but they're not locked into any rhythm, circadian rhythm or season. They just seem to happen, out of nowhere and without any particular rhythm. But the first flurry of these things really started when I was, like I said, about 13. I was with my friend, and he had all these gadgets at the house. The father was a doctor, and he had, this was back in what, 19, Jesus, like 66, 61, right? This is 60. And I'm over at his house. This is upstate New York. We lived in Loudonville, New York. And my bud and I, he had just gotten a tape recorder, reel to reel, and we're just joking around like boys do, making fart noises with our arms. And then in the middle of it, I said, "Ned, interview me right now." He said, "Why?" He said, "I just interviewed me." He says, "Okay, where are you?" I said, "Well, I'm heaven, and I'm here." And Ned asked the microphone, "So what happened?" I said, "Well, I was driving along up in Route 9N, up in the Adirondacks, right near Lake Placid. And as I was driving, I was in my XKE. And as I went around the turn, a tree jumped out into the middle of the road. And I hit it and I died. And I'm in heaven reporting back." And he's going, and I remember his face. This was a long time ago, but he was, and he's going, "What are you talking about?" Well, it turned out, his father had a friend. They had all these gadgets, but the father's friend was showed up and had a black XKE. I saw the XKE, and this whole story popped out at that minute when I saw the XKE. So it wasn't quite de novo, but it was an XKE, and I'd never seen one. And that was the car I said that this guy, his friend, died in. Well, a week later, I got a call from my friend. He says, "I can't play with you anymore." I said, "What happened? What's the matter?" He said, "Well, my father's friend was up on Route 9N, right where you had said. He heard the tape recording, and it was up near Lake Placid, and he went around a bend and hit a tree head on and died." So that was, his father didn't want me to hang around him anymore. It was just too freaky, right?
Wow.
Well, this is, so there were hundreds of these types of experiments. So experiences, not experiments. And I learned not to talk about them. So I've never talked about these publicly either. You're the only one I've ever, this right here. So I've never really talked about them because, if you're one of my colleagues and say, "What is he saying?" He's saying he has ESP experiences as well. I've had experiences. And so you're always trying to protect your colleagues, right? Because they don't want to think, maybe he's nuts or something. But, you hit a certain age, it's like, why don't you just tell everything as you know it? And so I've never, I was going to write in the book, but I never have mentioned it.
What other experiences jump to mind that kind of show this sort of stuff for you?
Well,
Because that was
I've
crazy.
taken I've taken the whole battery of tests numerous times. The online tests with the Gunsfeld. I've had the Gunsfeld thing, and the location tests, and there's 2 of us that have scored very high twice out of hundreds of thousands of people.
So can you break that down for our listeners? What does the Gunsfeld test look like, and what does a high score mean, like practically speaking?
The Gunsfeld is you're put into an isolation chamber. You're in a chair, and you put over your eyes the like usually something like ping pong balls cut in half. And so all you can see is this, and it's in a dark room. You just see this very blurry orange. So you don't see any specific thing. You're sitting there, you've got earphones on, and there's somebody in another building separated from you who is watching something, maybe movie clips, 10-second movie clips of different films, so pick chosen randomly, and out of 500 or 1,000 of them. And as this person sees them, you sit there, and if you perceive anything, you just start talking what you perceive. Okay, and then those are scored, and if it's close, if it seems like it's close, then you're given a higher score. And if it's not close at all to what's actually going on, then it's not. So that's the Gunsfeld.
What did you recall seeing in these tests?
Well, some of the I don't remember the movies. You know, there were movie clips of movies I only had seen of one of them in my life, so I didn't know a lot of them. You know, they were chosen by somebody else, not from my generation, so I didn't even know. But they're just images of what's happening in the scene, and it may be a horse running. It could be whatever you'd see in a film clip in a movie, maybe 10 or 15 seconds. It's played over a number of times, and then you do another one. And so, and then you just speak it into, it's tape recorded, and then it's scored of how close it was. Then there's that's the Gunsfeld. And then there is the remote viewing, which is done where you do it on a computer where you could be somebody somewhere. You're sitting where you are, and then somebody's in Abilene looking at something. You don't even know what they're looking at. But when they start the experiment, they're looking at something, and the idea is you're viewing through their eyes. What is that person in Abilene looking at? And you draw it, or you try to match it up. You can imagine how hard this is. It could be anything, absolutely anything. And so you and so the question is, how do you score these things? And sometimes they are literally very exact, and sometimes they have to do with the features. You can imagine having a building with a lot of lightning bolts. Well, you could say lightning bolts. They're not really lightning bolts, but they have the shape of lightning bolts, right? And so that would be a hit, a bunch of lightning bolts, or certain hard angles versus clouds, things like that, different features. And that's another one. And another, a separate one is a distance test, a location test. That on the screen, on the computer screen, a dot shows up, and then you move the cursor around to where you think the next dot is going to show up.
Oh, wow.
That distance, how close you are, is scored. And so there's these different types of tests to do this. So, so I've taken a lot of those, and I scored very high on those. And I think there's only 2 people who have scored over and over again, with high significant score. And the one was that Swiss violin maker, that one woman, and myself. And so I score high on that, and I've had years of very strange experiences, and where whole movies it occurs in dreams. I get a lot of the stuff in dreams that will just wake me up, and entire films will then play out. And so it's very disconcerting. I don't particularly like it. It may seem like it's fun, and it's not. I don't like it. And because then you're always wondering, you have a feeling of ominous feeling coming, then it's very disconcerting. So I don't particularly like it. It sounds like it would be fun, right? And some people think it's fun. But when things like that happen, and it will freak people out. But my family knows about it. My wife knows about it, and a bunch of my friends know about it. And I'll tell them beforehand, and they rather think it's fun, right? Other than that first time with my son, who just freaked out. He couldn't believe it. And but there are other sorts of things. Like a typical thing is I'll go into somebody's office or house or and I'll feel very uncomfortable. And they'll say, "What's wrong?" I said, "Something really bad happened in this seat right here." And they'll freak out because somebody will have been killed there. Because they'll have this sense of this flux, this what's called schlieren. Do you ever see like dissimilar fluids like water and oil, and they get the shimmering thing? Well, I'll see these rushes going very fast coming out of a spot in the ground. And I'm very close each time that something terrible happened, a murder or something. I mean, at one time it happened to a guy that I'd met, and he absolutely flipped out. He brought a priest over and an exorcist to get rid of this out of his body. You got to be kidding, man. And I said, but he goes
smoking sage and
well, I wasn't there. He told me, and I came over when the priest, the sexton, was leaving, and he was serious. He's freaked out completely. And now I think some of this stuff it sounds quite not believable, and I think there's a trivial answer to it. I think there is the following, for example. One thing is that I think some people are very aware of their surroundings at all times and all their thoughts. They probably have 50,000 perceptions of these mini perceptions a day. And if you remember your dreams, like I remember my dreams, I have lucid dreams all the time. I remember and they're wonderful. And I have a tendency to really pay attention. I had OCD growing up. It really helped with this because I look at every detail. And I can remember. My memory has been thoroughly tested many times. I got very good memory, and I work on memory. I've done a bunch of papers on memory too. So I study it. So I kind of know a bit about it. And so I think some people who are very aware of their thoughts and their feelings all the time. And I think another help is I grew up starting when I was a year and a half old with asthma. So and I still have asthma. So as a child, I was always very aware of every breath. So well, the breath and the thoughts, these would go on internally. When I had asthma attacks, it seemed like they go on for years, but I was very aware of my body, very aware of my thoughts and all these little feelings and what was pumping through my veins. And this, I think, gave I don't know if it's an advantage, but gave the ability to hold from day to day many perceptions in short-term memory. Well, if you have 50,000 things that go through your mind and you can remember them, the chances are that something is going to match up. And so it's going to seem like ESP if you can remember it all. If you're somebody who's not aware, this never would happen. They would never match up. So if I have the perception of the Pope is going to be assassinated this afternoon, if I have that perception, but I have 50,000 of these things, the chances are one of them is going to hit. So it's going to seem like perfect ESP.
But
so
how do you predict that? You've got 50,000. How do you predict that one is going to be?
Well, if you're aware of all these, if you're quite tuned into your thoughts, and you have short and intermediate term memory, then I think the chances are that something is going to line up. So I think it's a matter of attention and short term memory gives you what apparently looks like ESP. And if everybody was able to everybody paid attention, they would have it. I think it's something trivial like that.
Okay, but how does that explain the experience when you were younger with
It doesn't.
No.
It doesn't at all. It doesn't, because I was completely agnostic about who had the car or anything or where. And I had never been up there before.
Yeah.
Where I said he would die. Now that's a hard one. Some of these things are very hard, but I think a lot of them can be explained. I think, well, the earthquake stuff, when I know they're coming, is because it has to happen here. It's not like an earthquake anywhere. It has to happen where I am and where I'm going to be. And I think it has something to do with probably a piezoelectric effect because of the mass of rock that's under us. When they're squeezed, electrical currents are given off, and I can sense that, or anybody could, if they're listening. So I think, or radon being squeezed out of the earth, and I can smell it, and I have a different perception of that. So I think a lot of these could be explained trivially, as it were. Some of them I have not been able to explain for sure. They're too specific, but very specific people and things, and a whole series of events of that have occurred. And it happens to the T. So some of them are hard to explain.
It kind of, from a therapeutic bent, coming at this as a therapist, I see people in my day-to-day who have significant histories of trauma, or a lot of anxiety, stress, that sort of stuff, and they tend to pick up things in other people's faces, or a sense that they get from other people. This person can be trusted, this person can't be trusted, or they're able to, like, let's just say I do something with my face and they pick up on it straight away, and it may just be like a little twitch or a little, this and that. And they kind of, and then I can see in their face that they've seen me, that they've seen that I've done something that I've been trying to stifle or something like that. But they didn't say anything. They just kind of keep the tack on it. Some people, I was trying to, I mean, it's not very hard to notice when someone's trying to stifle a yawn. But some people would just be like, just pass that on. Other people would be like, oh, you're feeling a bit tired or something, and but then there's other things that the way that I explain is that being hyper tuned to other people, because that's what they've had to be over time. You're describing something similar, but in a way bigger context, I think.
Yeah, I work with this guy because my wife had non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a huge tumor. This was back in like 2000. And a friend of mine, who's a friend of his, was a neurologist, he said, well, you ought to talk to him. He's a master of masters in Qigong, And so we were working together anyway on some neurological thing. So he came down and I work with him. And after talking with him for a few weeks, he goes, I want you to come up. He says, I think you got the stuff. I go, what stuff? He goes, well, come up to my office. So I drove up to LA, went to his office, and he was, this Qigong, and he does it without touching anybody. He says, sit in my office. There'll be patients waiting to come in, look at them and tell me what they have. And so I sat there and I did what I always did from the time I was a kid. And so from the time I was a child, I would imagine this kind of white blue ball of light. This white blue ball of light would kind of shimmer, and then over a period of about 20 seconds would come together and form like almost a point, and it would hit me right here. Now that started when I was probably, my first dreams were of this thing. It would just hit me like light as a feather. It felt like it was infinitely heavy, but it touched me like a feather.
And so to our listeners who are just listening to this, Jim's just pointed to his, just between his eyes.
Yeah, just between my eyes. And when I was very young, it's my earliest memory is just laying there before I'd go to sleep each night, and this white blue shimmering light would come with my eyes closed, and it would collect into into a ball, and then it would finally become an infinitely small point. It was this, and it would just hit me like ping, and it felt like the whole universe was knocking me over, but it was so light at the same time. Wonderful sensation. And well, I used this when I got older. I can still kind of bring it up. And I can, when I just relax for about 30 seconds, I can imagine this ball of blue white light, and I can take the ball. And this is going to sound quite insane, but it's a game of a child that I still do. And I will send it, if I see somebody who's upset. Whenever I saw somebody who was emotionally upset at a party, even when I was a kid, or when I was a teenager or anything, and just take this ball and send it over to them to fix them. And I would try to see what was wrong. I could see, you can perceive in this, in this sort of deranged perception, that there would be pieces of them that would be sticking out like a magnet sticking the wrong way, like a bar magnet. And I would take that ball and it would go and realign that organ or piece of an organ sticking out the wrong way. And that's what I did as a young child and as a teenager. And even when I, even now when I see it, when you can't do anything, when I see somebody who's upset, and I'll take that ball and send it over. Well, he heard this and he goes, "This is exactly what Qigong is." I had never heard, I'd never. He goes, "No, no, it's a." So he goes, "Sit out there in my waiting room," and so I look at each one and write down what it was. That this I said, this person is a thymus. This person's spleen was off. This one person had a bad hip. I was right every time. But when I was sitting there, I would get the ball light to try to go and fix them. Well, he told me that this is exactly what Qigong is. So there's nothing new with this stuff, right? So this is like shamanistic old shit. And so it's wonderful that way. And but it's, I guess, being kind of tuned into people, like you're saying, or being hyper focused into everybody's little and you can use that every little move, the way their eye is, you can see what bothers them. You could use it to manipulate them. This is, for a psychopath, this is great stuff because you're reading them all the time and you're seeing their little reactions that they don't even know themselves. And you're seeing where they're weak. So you can manipulate, people that way. But it also could be used in a sort of a very positive way, even though it sounds completely bizarre. I mean, I know this sounds weird. And so this is why I don't talk about this stuff, because it sounds so strange. Nonetheless, this has been going on my whole life, and it's always been a curious thing.
I think it's so fascinating. I grew up in and I know you did too. You mentioned this in the book. You grew up in a Catholic home. You were Catholic Boy of the Year. You had a high religiosity growing up. And I grew up in a similar way. My parents, Christian, escaping a communist dictatorship in Romania, my dad said he received a prophecy at the time that he will be told when to go, when to leave. The very night he will leave, he will be told in a dream. And the weird thing is that he said that he went to sleep. He had a dream that just said, "Leave, go now." And he woke up, he packed up all his stuff, and with a couple of his friends, they left that very night. They didn't even tell their parents, nothing like that. He was 20 years old when he did this. And then later, decades later, he ran into a member of the Romanian Securitate, which is like a kind of secret police that was assigned to his own village or the area that he was there. And they'd been briefed that he was a kind of flight risk. So they were kind of tracking him, back in the 20s, back when he was 20, sorry. And he ran into this guy at a petrol station, and he went up to him and he's like, "Do you remember me?" And the guy looked at him and he's like, "I'm not quite sure." Yeah, and he's like, "Oh, my name is, Petru Barna, yeah." And there's like, yes, the one day I didn't follow you, you left. The one day. It's like,
yeah. Oh, man.
What the hell is that?
Oh, this was in like the 70s?
The 80s. So my dad, 1987.
Wow. He was tuned in. So your dad's a tuned in guy.
Yeah, it sounds that way. And he's highly religious. Myself, I tend to take all these sorts of things with an open mind, because I'm not an atheist. I'm not I think it would be a little bit harder to connect with somebody who may be non-theistic. I don't know, like or not. Like I see the possibility of these sorts of things.
If you're agnostic, I'm agnostic. I don't know what's going on. I mean, it's hard to have the tools to be able to even make any judgment of that. So I'm agnostic, not an atheist, but no, but agnostic. And
well, you would have to be agnostic with your experiences, I would say.
Yeah, right. But the people who know me, they always think, see, this is God talking to you. This is even scientists who are kind of religious. Jim, these are all signs. This is God telling you something. I'm going, it's not God telling me something. It's not. This is like so some sort of somatosensory visual thing. Yeah. But those have occurred regularly from the time they really started in force, all through college and beyond that. And the one thing, like I mentioned before, that suppresses it is nicotine. It always works. And it became a way to get out of it because it's a maddening sort of thing. If you get on a week of this stuff where you know what people are going to say, you know what's going to happen, you know, and it's like, and so, but I'm to a point, you know, an age of being an asthmatic, it's not so great to smoke. So
What about nicotine patches? Would they work?
they don't work.
No. Okay. So
No,
you
you
need the
gotta have, no, you
plasminogen
gotta, yeah, yeah,
stuff.
yeah. No, you need that straight buzz. Yeah, you have to trick yourself that way. We, so, but yeah, entire stories have come out. We've actually written screenplays that turned out to be true, but that from like dreams or some perceptions. So it's a wild thing. And my wife, who is a really, you know, she's an agnostic, kind of a mild believer, but she just takes this as something, and my kids do too, as something just kind of fun. And my grandkids, you know, and they think it's funny. And it is funny if you take it funny. But then, you know, anytime I have a feeling I'm worried about them, then it's not so funny. You know, that something's
No.
going to happen to somebody close to me. It's not so funny anymore. And that's the problem. The other stuff is funny, but it's somebody always worried, is this something? Um, but it's usually out of nowhere, and it just will come screaming out of nowhere, and will be spontaneous and can happen in dreams, can happen at any time. And but it will, but as I described it, and then I've talked to Dean Raid and Ed May about this, it's something very consistent happens. And here's for me, and they didn't, they've only heard something like that with one other thing, but my sensation is that all the background sensors in my body go flat. It's kind of this noiseless space. That is, my vision works, I can hear, everything is acute. It's not like I get into really some deranged sensory state, other than it seems like all the background noise in my world stops. So imagine, you know, in your retina and in your cochlea and in the sensors all over your body, they have what's called dark current. There's a background current. So there's always this background activity. So you don't perceive it, right? Because it's just the baseline. It's a baseline buzz. But imagine all these baseline buzz went to zero. It would be screaming at you. You know, the silence would be deafening. It's like it, well, because all the background noise is gone, and you're just left with signal. And that's what it feels like. So when that happens, I know something's coming. It happens, that opens the window to this stuff almost every time.
And did they check how your brain is functioning while you're doing this sort of stuff, or do you know what kind of areas?
Well, this is the trick. You know, the trick is doing that. No, and you know, and in talking with them, you know, how do you capture those moments, right? You got to rush them in and get them into a PET scanner. That takes days. You know, by that time it's gone. So, and all I can do is tell people, mark it down on a calendar, tell people, write it down, timestamp it exactly when it happens, you know, because to get, you know, 3:00 in the morning to call up people, to get everybody in and to get the IRB approval from the university to do this experiment, you know, it's gonna, it doesn't work because you'd have to get in immediately, you know, or you'd have to live with like a PET scanner in your house. Yeah. That's an idea, right? It's an idea. You live with a PET scanner or an fMRI, and every time you get one of these things, you jump in there. And that's the way to do it. But this is one of the frustrating things about really finding out what this is about, and people who get these things, whether it's, you know, however real it is, because they only told me one other person has that particular experience of this noiseless space. That is, all the noise in their world goes to zero. They're just left with signal. So it's this very bright sense of signal. Okay, imagine that, a very high fidelity. You know, you get rid of all the noise in the, you know, in the music you're listening to, like the pure sound of it. Or you're looking and you take off your glasses and you just, and you don't have any background. There's no birds tweeting. There's no flashing at all. Just the pure sensory. That's what it seems like for me. So I know when it's coming. That's when it's coming. And it should be reflected in brain activity because it's very palpable when this happens.
I have an image of a dog barking at an empty space, that often people say that dogs can sense things that humans can't sense. Do you think that this sort of sense can happen in these types of animals as well?
Oh, sure. I would imagine it might even be easier because they're not confused by social life in the same way, by noisy social life. They have their own social life, and that's why when every day I go out for an hour or two in my backyard in the jacuzzi, and either handicap the horse races or or read or just sit there, and I have all these little animals coming up, these butterflies and hummingbirds and different birds that know me, and they'll come up, and I just try to watch them maybe for an hour, their world, and how they, the communication and how they're sensing certain things, and so I'm a biologist, so this makes sense, right? I mean, I even talk to my parsley plant, so what the hell? But I'm almost more connected to animals and plants and than I am humans sometimes. But I often imagine trying to communicate with animals in that way, because sometimes I'll be looking at them, like a little hummingbird come flying up and look right at me, just go all over because I've been thinking about her. I mean, there's one in particular, or there's even these monarch butterflies that go out of their way to like buzz me and just make their presence known. And it's fun. I mean, I don't take it seriously beyond that, but I do think during those moments, to answer your question, that that if we've got it, certainly animals would have it. And there is some indication. There is, Dean Radin, they did an initial genetic experiment, and they had one open reading frame that was in all the people that they had who regularly score high on the ESP experiments. And it's an open reading frame, so it's not a coding gene. It's one of the, probably a transposon or one of the, part of the junk DNA, which is, we know now is more and more important for all sorts of things like schizophrenia and Alzheimer's and development of humans as humans. We study these in Neanderthal and soprano man who's had Heidelbergensis. It's about 450,000 years old. We're studying that in now, and we study the DNA and skulls and inferred brain shapes of Neanderthals and modern humans in Upper Paleolithic. So we're looking for these changes in genes, but it's hard to find anything unique. But he has found one unique open reading frame. But we don't know what it does, right? He doesn't know what it does. So we're trying to figure that out. Just get a larger group of people who show some talent to see if there's some genetics behind it.
I do apologize, but this is the first time I've heard of open reading frame. Can you define that? Kind of make it a bit more accessible?
Yeah, so there's about there are about 20,000 genes that are transcribed. This is genetics, that are genes like the warrior gene that makes an mRNA, that then makes a protein that then is involved in serotonin, which is the transmitter. So you have these very strong connections between the gene and the mRNA and then the protein or substance it codes for that has an effect. It's about 20,000. But most of the genome is of this other junk stuff. And it turns out the junk stuff, a large percentage of it is what's called these transposons, which have been taken up from viruses over millennia and over millions of years. So these are pieces of DNA. They're pieces of mostly retroviruses that get into us and then are used by us to rearrange our DNA, make multiple copies of certain things, and also gives us, as it turns out, a lot of flexibility to fight diseases like viruses and bacteria. So it's very important for the immune system, but they're also involved in creating cancers. So you don't get anything for free, right? In biology, it saves you in one way for with infectious diseases, but these transposons and retrotransposons will then be likely to cause cancers, but it also seemed to be involved in our evolution, our brain and body evolution. And so these have become much more important. Well, some of these they have different names, these elements that are non-genetic structural genes, right? But they regulate genes. Well, they have names like lines, L-I-N-E, signs, S-N-E, ALU, ALUs. There's different segments, and they can be found oftentimes near these structural genes, the genes that are really coding for like oxytocin and serotonin and things like that. And some of these are in what are called open reading frames. And these open reading frames are just, there's not anything obvious they do. It's like they're just sequences that don't make any sense until you figure out what they do. And so the idea with these is now figuring out what they do, because they do something. And we studied these a lot, and in schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, and like I said, in ancient hominids, in Neanderthals, et cetera, because they have a lot to do. Also, we think with the regulation of emotion in the brain. We just did a paper last year on how the way the cold cognitive brain and the emotions funnel into the amygdala, and then they're brought together, and where they're brought together with those interneurons in the amygdala are loaded with these transposons. So we think it's an important place where the cold cognitive mind and the hot cognitive mind, that is emotion and thinking, come together.
What's that paper called?
Well, it's under, if you look under Fallon, Macciardi, M-A-C-C-I-A-R-D-I. If you look under those two in the Journal Comparative Neurology, there's that one, and we're doing it, finishing a couple right now, actually this week, on in other disorders. And so these are going to be very important for psychiatry and understanding psychiatric disorders, because we're finding more and more of these in psychiatric disorders and neurological disorders, and so in an evolution. So these are fascinating. They were once called junk DNA, and these were found in 1948 by Barbara McClintock. It's like, what are these things? She found it in corn, and she called them jumping genes, because they keep moving around all over the place. And that's what they do. They cut and paste, they copy and paste, and they jump around. So they're all over the place. They're like fly shit, And so, and it's like, well, what do these things do? And it finally, in the 80s, she got a Nobel Prize. She found this thing. It's like 40 years later, it's like, well, they do something, And this is a frustrating thing sometimes of science, is like, you don't know what the meaning of it is until 40, 50 years later. And then all of a sudden, it's the most important thing in the world, for that particular science. So yeah, these will become more important to, I know you have people in psychology and psychiatry who listen to your podcast and everything, and they should be looking for these. They're just fascinating. But it comes from mostly infections from retroviruses like HIV and others. And it's just that we use them and they use us. That's the story. The whole battle for 3.5 billion years is the fight between the bacteria and the viruses. All of our stuff is very minor. That's the fight. But the viruses come in, use the same sort of machinery. It's related to a CRISPR phenomena to then use us to reproduce themselves. But then we have ways of fighting it and using them to fight other diseases. But it comes at a cost, and the cost is cancers, but also psychiatric disorders. But it may not be a bad thing. When you look at many of these disorders, psychiatric disorders, it looks like the brain is trying to reinvent itself, to remodel itself. There are experiments going on. And so when you look at people, you take somebody with ESP, or you take somebody who's got schizoaffective disorder. These are the schizoaffectives. That's where you get a lot of the shamans who are having these visions and things, and who have insights and who, take a lot of drugs and hallucinate too. And so it's a way, you can look at it as a way of an experiment in creating a new brain. And so there's a lot of negative effects, but they maybe be driving us to a new sort of homo. This is a new homo, homo cybernicus or something.
Yeah.
Oh, that's it. So what's good and bad is only a matter of the time, right? If there's something to destroy happy humanity, but the good thing is, and if you wait 300 years, everything comes back in a flurry. It's like weeding a garden. So that's the idea of goodness and badness is based on time, nothing else.
I think it's interesting because the question that comes up in my mind is, how is this all related to psychopathy? And you kind of responded with schizoaffective disorder. For those who aren't aware of schizoaffective disorder, do you mind giving a bit of a relay on that and the relationships between what you're describing with the brain?
With psychopathy versus and the ability to have, give me specific.
Yes,
question.
yeah. Let's.
I have an answer, but I want to make sure I'm answering your actual question.
So schizoaffective disorder is it's a different type of disorder than schizophrenia, but then it shares common traits with psychopathic traits as well, as far as I'm aware. My question is, what's going on in the brain with these sorts of people who have these experiences and have these sorts of brains, so to speak?
Yeah, usually so if you look at people who are highly creative in some way, so people with bipolar disorder, a fair percent of their life, a whole part of their brain is turned off. And when that's turned off, it releases other parts of the brain. It may release creativity. It's like with psychopaths, if you can turn off the orbital ventromedial cortex and amygdala, if you turn that off, then you allow other things to float free. And in fact, there's a higher percentage of creativity in psychopaths, a higher percent in schizophrenics, certainly in schizoaffectives, and people where there are parts of the brain turned off, then seems to allow other parts to then fully function without any brakes on. And so, so people who have that, like shamans who have schizoaffective disorder, or people who have psychopathy, they are, what they have turned off are the parts of the brain that socialize you, that say, don't do that, that's evil, don't do that, it's going to hurt somebody. Well, if that's turned off, you're wide open. It's uncorked headers. I mean, uncorked headers is a term from when we were growing up with hot rods, right? And you have the headers that come off the engine on hot rods, and then you take the mufflers off and you just straight out, that's a boom, 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 boom. Those are uncorked headers. So it's a brain on uncorked headers. And so you can see how somebody who's not socialized, who said, don't do that, your conscience, it not only inhibits unacceptable antisocial behavior, it inhibits creativity at the same time. So I think what they have in common, these psychiatric disorders, one idea is that there's this thing called P, a factor P. It's like an intelligence, Spearman's G, there's some undefined intelligence quotient that everybody knows it when they hear it. When you're talking to somebody really smart and they have G, they have Spearman's G. Of course, well, there's this other, idea of a P for psychiatric disorders, of all those related disorders of the ones we're talking about. And though they all have a common sort of pathology. And that's why, many times it's hard to distinguish them. They say, well, there's no such thing as psychopathy because it overlaps with narcissistic personality disorder, and it overlaps something with borderline, and it overlaps a little with schizophrenia. It's because all this overlap means it's not a pure thing, which means that there's something else probably going on. And that's something, other core problem, maybe neurodevelopmental and genetic, that's the P, right? So it's this P is this common factor, but the P factor also releases the brain and it seems to make more people creative. It's very hard to find really straight, normal, law-abiding citizens and who are perfectly fine, who are creative, right? It's hard to find them, and you want to be that. You want to marry that. You want to be around. You want your kids to be that. But usually, with some creativity, you're dealing with a problem somewhere, and so I think that's one way of looking at that.
It's interesting. I I've got quite the history growing up. I used to get into a lot of trouble in my teen years, broke a lot of laws, did all that sort of stuff, dropped out of school early, ended up going back, years later and kind of doing what I'm doing right now. But I've always been the type of person who I was writing little stories since I was like a young kid. I would draw a lot. I would do a lot of these creative endeavors. I loved reading or listening to books and doing that sort of stuff. And I have a very anti-authoritarian kind of bent towards me, even now when I see things like lockdowns and the impacts of this sort of stuff it's having on the community and that sort of stuff. It brings up another part of me, but I never quite thought about it like that, because the way that you put it, that if I have a deficit in one area, and for me, it's a bit paradoxical because I don't necessarily get emotionally invested in many people unless I really care about them. Like I've got a few people who I'm very emotionally invested in.
Mm-hmm.
They're my family. But if something happens to somebody else, I don't really feel it. It's kind of like that very cold, and we talked about it last time, that cold empathy almost, or the, that sympathy type thing. But then I'm also I love to invest my time into learning new things, and I'm constantly doing something different. I'm always doing something new. I want to test myself. I want to do that sort of stuff. But I love the way that you put it there. I wonder whether I'd be interested to have some sort of look at my types of traits or my types of behaviors and that sort of stuff, and how that kind of compiles together. But
it sounds you have like chronic oppositional defiant disorder on top of, you're creative, and you did a lot of what you said you did growing up. I love to do. I was always drawing things. I was making cartoons. I was making weird stuff like that, and was so I can resonate with what you're saying in growing up, and if something's just not giving a shit about, any rules like that, and doing things. But I don't know how social you were. I was very social, so I was always organizing groups of people to do mischievous things, right? Because it was such a gas. It's fun. I never thought of it as anything but like creative fun. That's too, I was like that. I still think that way. So I think, we probably have some overlap in this, but there are all sorts of, there are rules that are probably inherent, right? That Plato had the sense of. There are certain rules that he didn't know genetics, but he kind of knew genetics in the sense that you're born with a set of these, and these are genetically set up, and they're wired in the orbital ventromedial cortex and the amygdala. So they're instincts that seem like knowing right from wrong and doing the right and wrong thing. Now, if those don't develop that way right from the beginning, you don't have a sense of that at all. So you're out of the box immediately. Some people can get it through other sorts of experiences. It's harder. It's easier when it's just genetically early on, ready to fly, right?
Yeah.
And it's very natural. It's not painful. Painful to other people, not to you. But to people who go through, traumas, and they have to get rearranged a bit, that's a little bit more painful and clunky. But you can kind of get there at the same. You can get there at the same time. This would be like the psychopathic versus the sociopathic way. One is, well, I was born that way and it's a blast. The other is like I had this shit beat out of me for 8 years, and then I stole a bunch of cars and made, and there's a different, same effect but different core, where they come from. So, but it's hard to find. I always look for people who are completely normal, who are creative. because they're unicorns. You know, if they say that they're completely normal, you'll find something really kinky weird about them, or something, you know, something psychiatric that they're hiding well, and it can take a while to get to that. But I have not found. I'm not an, you know, looking for an honest man in the world. It's not an honest man. It's just I'm looking for the woman who is completely normal, who is also very creative. I'm sure they're there. I just have never met them. I'm going on 74, and I'm still waiting.
Wow. Okay. It's a good point. Yeah. People who are very good at their art are incredibly out there as well in other areas. Yeah. So I think we've come to almost like a natural winding down of our
Yeah,
conversation.
sure.
But I think
Have we talked about the two things you wanted to talk about?
No, we've talked about the first thing. The second thing depends on the time that you have moving forward. And
We
so,
can do that at another time. This feels like
yeah,
a natural place to stop. And if it's still interest in it, we could set something else up. I love talking to you. You
yes,
seem
yeah.
quite frank, quite honest, and a little daffy. You have your own quiet daffiness, which I like. And you remind me of my brother Mark, who's a very creative guy, and also, but he's a quiet, and you know, he knows who he is, right? But he also has a little bit of kick in his head too, and most of my brothers and cousins are like that, but he especially, kind of the quiet one who has the creativity, and that you remind me of him, and I'm very fond of him.
Oh,
So
that's nice. No, that's good. I would love to set up another concert. I feel like I feel more comfortable to set this sort of thing up because I think we gel quite well in terms of conversation and where we're kind of rearing off to. So I think that's a good place. I do think it's a natural place to end, and I really appreciate again your time today. Let's set something else up, and we'll explore a few other things and take it from there.
okay, Emil, great talking to you again, buddy.
Thank you so much, Jim. You have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye bye.